Alexander's Bridge by Willa Cather. Chapter 1. Late one brilliant April afternoon, Professor Lucius Wilson stood at the head of Chestnut Street, looking about him with the pleased air of a man of taste who does not very often get to Boston. He had lived there as a student, but for 20 years and more, since he had been professor of philosophy in a Western university, he had seldom come east except to take a steamer for some foreign port. Wilson was standing quite still, contemplating with a whimsical smile the slanting street, with its worn paving, its irregular, gravely colored houses, and the row of naked trees on which the thin sunlight was still shining. The gleam of the river at the foot of the hill made him blink a little, not so much because it was too bright, as because he found it so pleasant. The few passers-by glanced at him unconcernedly, and even the children who hurried along with their school bags under their arms seemed to find it perfectly natural that a tall brown gentleman should be standing there, looking up through his glasses at the grey housetops. The sun sank rapidly. The silvery light had faded from the bare boughs, and the watery twilight was setting in when Wilson at last walked down the hill, descending into cooler and cooler depths of greyish shadow. His nostril, long unused to it, was quick to detect the smell of wood smoke in the air, blended with the odor of moist spring earth and the saltiness that came up the river with the tide. He crossed Charles Street between jangling streetcars and shelving lumber drays, and after a moment of uncertainty, wound into Brimmer Street. The street was quiet, deserted, and hung with a thin bluish haze. He had already fixed his sharp eye upon the house which he reasoned should be his objective point, when he noticed a woman approaching rapidly from the opposite direction. Always an interested observer of women, Wilson would have slackened his pace anywhere to follow this one with his impersonal, appreciative glance. She was a person of distinction, he saw at once, and moreover, very handsome. She was tall, carried her beautiful head proudly, and moved with ease and certainty. One immediately took for granted the costly privileges and fine spaces that must lie in the background from which such a figure could emerge with this rapid and elegant gait. Wilson noted her dress too, for, in his way, he had an eye for such things, particularly her brown furs and her hat. He got a blurred impression of her fine color, the violets she wore, her white gloves, and, curiously enough, of her veil, as she turned up a flight of steps in front of him and disappeared. Wilson was able to enjoy lovely things that passed him on the wing as completely and deliberately as if they had been dug-up marvels, long anticipated, and definitely fixed at the end of a railway journey. For a few pleasurable seconds, he quite forgot where he was going, and only after the door had closed behind her did he realize that the young woman had entered the house, to which he had directed his trunk, from the South Station that morning. He hesitated a moment before mounting the steps. "Can that?" he murmured in amazement. "Can that possibly have been Mrs. Alexander?" When the servant admitted him, Mrs. Alexander was still standing in the hallway. She heard him give his name, and came forward holding out her hand. "Is it you indeed, Professor Wilson? I was afraid that you might get here before I did. I was detained at a concert, and Bartley telephoned that he would be late. Thomas will show you your room. Had you rather have your tea brought to you there, or will you have it down here with me, while we wait for Bartley?" Wilson was pleased to find that he had been the cause of her rapid walk, and with her he was even more vastly pleased than before. He followed her through the drawing room into the library, where the wide back windows looked out upon the garden and the sunset and a fine stretch of silver-colored river. A harp-shaped elm stood stripped against the pale-colored evening sky, with ragged last year's birds' nests in its forks, and through the bare branches the evening star quivered in the misty air. The long brown room breathed the peace of a rich and amply guarded quiet. Tea was brought in immediately and placed in front of the wood fire. Mrs. Alexander sat down in a high-backed chair and began to pour it, while Wilson sank into a low seat opposite her and took his cup with a great sense of ease and harmony and comfort. "You have had a long journey, haven't you?" Mrs. Alexander asked, after showing gracious concern about his tea. "And I am so sorry Bartley is late. He's often tired when he's late. He flatters himself that it is a little on his account that you have come to this Congress of Psychologists." "It is," Wilson assented, selecting his muffin carefully. "And I hope he won't be tired tonight. But on my own account, I'm glad to have a few moments alone with you before Bartley comes. I was somehow afraid that my knowing him so well would not put me in the way of getting to know you." "That's very nice of you." She nodded at him above her cup and smiled, but there was a little formal tightness in her tone which had not been there when she greeted him in the hall. Wilson leaned forward. Have I said something awkward? I live very far out of the world, you know, but I didn't mean that you would exactly fade dim, even if Bartley were here. Mrs. Alexander laughed relentingly. Oh, I'm not so vain. How terribly discerning you are. She looked straight at Wilson, and he felt that this quick, frank glance brought about an understanding between them. He liked everything about her, he told himself, but he particularly liked her eyes. When she looked at one directly for a moment, they were like a glimpse of fine, windy sky that may bring all sorts of weather. Since you noticed something, Mrs. Alexander went on, it must have been a flash of the distrust I have come to feel whenever I meet any of the people who knew Bartley when he was a boy. It is always as if they were talking of someone I had never met. Really, Professor Wilson, it would seem that he grew up among the strangest people. They usually say that he has turned out very well, or remark that he always was a fine fellow. I never know what reply to make. Wilson chuckled and leaned back in his chair, shaking his left foot gently. I expect the fact is that we none of us knew him very well, Mrs. Alexander, though I will say for myself that I was always confident he'd do something extraordinary. Mrs. Alexander's shoulders gave a slight movement, suggestive of impatience. Oh, I should think that might have been a safe prediction. Another cup, please? Yes, thank you. But predicting, in the case of boys, is not so easy as you might imagine, Mrs. Alexander. Some get a bad hurt early and lose their courage, and some never get a fair wind. Bartley. He dropped his chin on the back of his long hand and looked at her admiringly. Bartley caught the wind early, and it has sung in his sails ever since. Mrs. Alexander sat looking into the fire with intent preoccupation, and Wilson studied her half-averted face. He liked the suggestion of stormy possibilities in the proud curve of her lip and nostril. Without that, he reflected, she would be too cold. I should like to know what he was really like when he was a boy. I don't believe he remembers, she said suddenly. Won't you smoke, Mr. Wilson? Wilson lit a cigarette. No, I don't suppose he does. He was never introspective. He was simply the most tremendous response to stimuli I have ever known. We didn't know exactly what to do with him. A servant came in and noiselessly removed the tea tray. Mrs. Alexander screened her face from the firelight, which was beginning to throw wavering bright spots on her dress and hair as the dusk deepened.